nonprofits. Okay, so off we go. For those of you who are not familiar with the Center for Nonprofits, we are New Jersey's statewide nonprofit network and champion for the charitable community. We have since 1982 strengthened nonprofits individually and as a community through public policy, professional guidance and education, trainings, conferences, and cost-saving member services. If your organization is a member of the Center for Nonprofits, thank you for your support and involvement as we pursue this work together. If you're not a member, we do invite you to join us and experience firsthand how membership will work for you. The Center is also part of the National Council of Nonprofits, the nation's largest nonprofit network, over 25,000 organizations strong. The Council of Nonprofits serves as an advocate, central coordinator, and mobilizer to help nonprofits achieve greater collective impact in local communities across the country. The Council of Nonprofits is if you are a member of the Center for Nonprofits, you are also a member of the Council of Nonprofits. So we certainly encourage you to check their resources as well. Before we begin, I wanted to call your attention to a couple of upcoming events that we have going on at the center. The first is the Ultimate Grant Proposal Blueprint. This is a multi-session course. It's 10 sessions online at your own pace, and registration for this course covers up to 3 people of your team. It's very popular. We've been partnering with Grants Magic for quite a while now, and if you are a member of the center, you get a $100 discount off of registration for the course. So encourage you to check that out if you haven't done so. And we're also very excited to have just launched something new here at the center, Member Mondays, which are exclusively for center members. These are lightly structured get-togethers. It's a networking session. It's time for us to all catch up and say what's on our mind, share information, ask questions. Sometimes we might have a guest speaker or a topic on the agenda. We will be holding these every 2 weeks. We had our first one a week ago Monday, and our second one will be this Monday, March 1st. So we hope you will join us for those. They're going to be every 2 weeks, and if you need login information, contact us. There's more information on the center events on our website, so we hope you will check that out as well. As part of our work to improve understanding about nonprofits and drive sound public policy, we regularly survey New Jersey's charitable community about the issues, challenges, and opportunities they're facing. And one of these, of course, is the report that we are unveiling today, our annual Issues and Trends Survey, where every year we poll New Jersey nonprofits about how they fared in the prior year, what worked well, what didn't, what's their funding outlook looking like, and other important trends and issues that are of current importance. Given the tumultuous year that was 2020 with the human and economic devastation of COVID-19 and the heightened call for racial justice, this year's survey is especially timely. We're grateful to everyone who took the time to complete it, and we're glad that you were able to share your insights with us. I would like to thank Czipo Co. and Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield of New Jersey for generously supporting the survey again this year, and I'd like to invite Sally Glick, Principal and Chief Growth Strategist at Czipo Co. and a board member of the Center for Nonprofits, and Jonathan Pearson, Executive Director, Corporate Social Responsibility at Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield of New Jersey, to say a couple words before we begin. Sally, do you want to start?
Sure, thanks. So you can see that much has changed. We've lived through a pandemic that we never, ever anticipated, but much also stays the same. And one thing that always stays the same is the Center for Nonprofits and the things that they accomplish on behalf of the community day in and day out, year in and year out. There's no one I would rather partner with, Czipo would rather partner with, me personally, with Jonathan, my good friend, but our firm also clearly is delighted to be a sponsor again and to be a partner with Horizon because of the stature they have in this community. It's an absolute delight to be able to contribute to getting the right information to the right people at the right time. Thank you for giving us that opportunity.
Thank you, Sally. John?
Yeah, thank you. So I'd just like to say a big thank you to Sally. Pleasure partnering with her in Sobel. They do terrific nonprofit community in the state. And also Linda and the entire team at the center. Sal, I'm going to just echo what Sally said. It's an invaluable organization, the work of the center. And as we were living through the pandemic from a corporate funder perspective, I got to tell you that the data that came out last year really helped to inform and shape how we had to pivot as a grant maker within the state of New Jersey and to help all of the nonprofits that we work with and look at new opportunities. So we shared this information with our senior leadership team of the company and our foundation board. This is terrific insight and feedback that, again, helps inform Horizon as a corporate grant maker. And it's a terrific piece of work. I know there's a lot of other folks to thank, but we're really proud to put our brand with this product and also with the center and with Sobel. So thank you guys. I appreciate it, and turn it back to you, Linda.
Thank you so much, John. Thanks to you and Horizon and Sally and everybody at Sobel Co. for supporting our work throughout the year and supporting the survey. Before I dive into the survey results, which will be the bulk of the presentation, I just wanted to give you a couple of reminders about the nonprofit community in New Jersey. And for those of you who have seen this information before, you may notice a little bit of a change in the slide. We have updated information. It is still pre-COVID because the IRS info lags a little bit, but we do have updated data, which means that according to the IRS, there are 38,000 plus 501c3 organizations in New Jersey, still employing pre-COVID about 10% of the state's private workforce, more than many major industries, and spending collectively $50 billion by the charitable public charities in New Jersey every year. Nonprofits, of course, marshal the energies and talents of 1.5 million volunteers, and these are also the lifeblood of our organizations. So it's important to remember that nonprofits are vital to the social and economic well-being of the state, and we are strong partners in providing community solutions. And of course, as with countless other crises, the COVID-19 pandemic has underscored just how essential nonprofits are, from frontline health and human service providers to the comfort, healing, and inspiration of the arts and everything in between. And New Jerseyans are going to need nonprofits to get them through to recovery and beyond. It cannot be overstated just how important nonprofits have been through the pandemic, and that is not going to dissipate anytime soon. If anything, that need will become more acute. But of course, the other thing that we have pointed out quite a bit, we and many others, is there are challenges with respect to the nonprofit community, and high on that list is an ongoing capacity gap because resources for nonprofits are squeezed across the board. This is because demand and expenses has outpaced funding and resources for many years. This is not a new problem, but it's become much more acute. And of course, in a time of crisis like with COVID, we see the devastating effects of this, and we point this out in the report as well. And of course, nonprofits are operating in an incredibly volatile climate with the human and social impact of COVID-19, a very polarized public policy and political landscape, the broadening wealth gap in New Jersey and throughout the country, technological challenges and opportunities, and a renewed push to address racism and racial inequality. This landscape, of course, affects everything that nonprofits are doing, and this kind of information is in our survey results as well. So the survey data in this year's Nonprofit Trends and Outlook report are based on 251 responses from New Jersey 501c3 organizations that were collected online between January 13th and February 7th, 2021. Again, we thank everyone who took the time to weigh in on the survey. It fuels advocacy, it fuels an informed community, and it can fuel good planning decisions and good public policy. Most organizations have, of course, reported moderate or significant disruptions due to COVID-19, but the pandemic has affected different organizations in profoundly different ways. For frontline organizations, such as those providing health and human services, demand for services continued to skyrocket, but expenses went up even faster. Meanwhile, arts and cultural organizations, which may have had to suspend their activities and performances, saw demand decrease, but revenue drop even more. Even with many organizations having to suspend services during the pandemic, even temporarily, demand for services still outpaced funding. Overall, nearly half of surveyed nonprofits reported that demand rose in 2020, but only a third said that their funding had gone up. And equally concerning, among those nonprofits that said that their demand had risen, only 76%, or about 3/4, said that they were able to serve more people in the same period. So the implications for delivery of services and meeting community needs are rather profound. We also asked nonprofits in our survey if they had lost revenue, and if they did, we asked them if they could possibly estimate, quantify what they had lost. In this survey, about 40% of our respondents, 96 organizations, gave us those estimates, and collectively they estimated that they lost more than $76 million due to the crisis. The ranges were very, very wide. They ranged from a low, I'll put that in quotes because some organizations, $500 is a lot of money, but it ranged from $500 to $40 million. But the median reported loss was $100,000 in these organizations. We also asked what percentage of their budgets their losses comprised, and the median that was reported there was 20%. And again, losses ranged from 1% of budget to the entire thing. Again, a lot of cause for concern here. Also, disturbingly, more than a quarter of our respondents said that they had to lay off or furlough staff in 2020 because of the pandemic. And at the time the survey was taken, half of these organizations still had not restored any of these staff cuts. And only 30% of the organizations in our survey said that support and revenue had actually exceeded expenses in their last fiscal year. The rest were either reporting flat or year-end deficits. And what that means is either they're going into debt or they're dipping into their reserves. There are a lot of implications for this as well. On the national level, the jobs picture is pretty sober as well. The Johns Hopkins Center for Civil Society Studies has been tracking this on a monthly basis, and jobs are still down. Nonprofit jobs across the country are still down by nearly $1 million jobs, $960,000, compared to pre-COVID February of 2020. And that is obviously very concerning. There's no question that the government assistance that has been available during this time for those who were able to take advantage of it has been a lifeline. 2/3 of the respondents in our survey received some form of COVID-19 assistance from the government in 2020. That can include things like the Paycheck Protection Program, forgivable loans, Small Business Administration's Economic Injury Disaster Loans, also known as EIDL, the New Jersey Economic Development Authority grants and loans, and many others. These things were so important to organizations' ability to keep going, to keep their staff and programs going in 2020. 60% of respondents said that these loans and grants were important to their services. And nearly a quarter of these respondents said they probably couldn't have gotten through 2020 without this aid. And they also say they will need additional assistance from the government if they are to make it through 2021. That just underscores how important the government aid and programs have been, and how important it is for additional relief to be forthcoming. This chart is in the report, so don't worry, that's a little bit tiny, but this is a depiction of, for each different source of funding, our survey respondents' reports of whether funding increased, decreased, or remained relatively stable. So the very dark bars are reported funding increases. The ones next to that in orange were reported decreases, and then the rest is flat. A couple of things I want to call your attention to. Special events, no surprise there. With so many events having to be canceled, though 69% of organizations that reported that they get funds from special events said funding from that source decreased in 2020. Again, it's logical considering what happened in 2020, but it's a pretty stark graphical depiction. Fees for service, again, that could be fees from events, it could be fees for other kinds of services that couldn't be provided in person. That also went down for a lot of organizations. In terms of foundations and corporations, decreases for the corporate world did outweigh increases. For foundations, it was a little bit more even with more foundations, more organizations reporting increases from foundations. But again, this chart is in the report and you can dive into that with in a lot more detail. But other funding trends, there are some consistencies with respect to what we've seen in our survey and what has been reported nationally. The Blackbaud Institute just came out with their annual charitable giving report, and they estimate that giving to smaller charities, which they define as under $1 million budget, declined by more than 7% in 2020. Giving to larger charities rose by 5.3%. Why does that matter? Because, well, it matters because any decreases are a little bit sobering, but charities of under $1 million make up 90% of the charitable sector. This is most of the organizations in the charitable community. These are the grassroots community organizations, and we would actually at the center think of $1 million charity as a mid-size, but still, and this is a trend that's also not new, but in terms of implications for services and the ability to keep meeting community needs, it is a very sobering statistic and bears watching very carefully. Looking ahead to 2021, more nonprofits expect demand for services and expenses to rise versus funding. 70% of the organizations in our survey expected that demand was going to increase in 2021. Meanwhile, only 39% were expecting that their overall funding was going to increase. And again, that speaks to the capacity gap, it speaks to the resource gap, and over time, the implications there are very, very significant. This is another small chart, but a couple of things I will point out. Organizations in our survey were perhaps most optimistic or hopeful that donations from individuals would bounce back in 2021 and that they would be able to host more special events in 2021. But there's a lot of uncertainty there out there, and very understandably so. But those are, the hope is that we'll have vaccines kicking in, restrictions will be lifted, there'll be the opportunity to resume some of the services that were not able to be provided during the height of the pandemic. So during our survey, we asked nonprofits a couple of things. We asked them what your top challenges are that are facing your individual organization, your top 5. There's a laundry list that they can choose from and they can write in their own. But we ask what your top issues are affecting your organization. And we also ask what you think the top challenges are that are affecting the well-being of the charitable community over the next 5 years or so. So the first graph here has to do with individual organizations and what they felt were the top issues affecting their organizations. So financial uncertainty, given the climate, that makes an awful lot of sense. Almost half of our respondents said that was the top issue, or that was one of their top 5. More nonprofits said that than anything else. This was followed by branding and communications, the need to stand out from the crowd or to articulate your value proposition better than perhaps you've been able to before, or just provide more resources to devote to that. That is always high on the list, but that was number 2. Third was boards, the need for a stronger board or being able to recruit board members, followed by COVID-19 recovery and increased demand for services. Rounding out this chart were some other things: the need for diversity, to improve diversity and cultural competence, affording goods, quality staff, the need for strategic planning. Planning in this environment is extraordinarily difficult, and a number of organizations have said that this is very challenging and they would like some assistance to the extent that it's available. Turning to the sector at large, a little bit of a different kind of result. Foundation and corporate funding was mentioned by more respondents than anything else, 54%, followed by COVID-19 recovery. Tied for third is advancing diversity and equity in nonprofits. 40% of our respondents identified that as one of the most important issues for the nonprofit community. And that is a direct reflection of the events of the past year and the heightened awareness of the need for racial and social justice. This was tied with infrastructure and capacity building. And of course, we know that those things are not actually separate, that all of this goes hand in hand, and a good, high performing, effective organization is intentional and about its work in advancing diversity and equity in its own organization and beyond. And the fifth most frequently mentioned was, of course, attracting and retaining board members. That is usually in the top 5, and this was not an exception. Rounding out some of the other top categories, giving and volunteering incentives. There is still concern about the effect of the 2017 tax law and the fact that giving is not as incentivized as it used to be. There are efforts underway, of course, in New Jersey to try to create a state level initiative and by advocates across the country to strengthen the charitable deduction, including a stronger deduction for non-itemizers. Federal funding, the federal budget, attracting, retaining workers, and improving public understanding and appreciation about nonprofits. That is also something that is frequently cited as a challenge. And without question, of course, the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on people of color. The longstanding disparities, years of underinvestment in critical systems and communities, these have laid bare and been exacerbated by the pandemic. And this is reflected in our survey results. While the COVID-19 crisis has had a dramatic effect on nonprofits across the board, there were some notable distinctions in the effects on organizations that reported that they primarily serve communities of color compared with those that did not primarily serve communities of color. So for example, organizations that primarily serve communities of color in our survey were more likely they would comprise a greater proportion of frontline nonprofits, health and human services, organizations providing direct services in person. Organizations serving primarily communities of color were more likely to report that they provided services that were deemed essential by the governor in his initial executive orders. And relatedly, a greater percentage of organizations that primarily serve communities of color reported that their demand for services rose in 2020, and they were also less likely to have suspended services even temporarily during the pandemic. It just speaks to the impact of the pandemic on falling disproportionately on certain communities, and the nonprofit organizations that are providing those services are also being affected in different ways. There are a number of things that contribute to these trends: the heightened human needs and disparate impact of the virus and economic consequences on people of color, but also the greater likelihood that human service and other frontline organizations may derive more of their revenues from government, where unfortunately, historically, funding often fails to cover the full cost of providing services. And of course, there are a lot of other factors that come into play. But especially in light of the longstanding underrepresentation of people of color in nonprofit leadership and philanthropic decision-making circles, and of course the call for racial and social justice. Recognition of the urgency of addressing racial disparities is growing. As I mentioned before, 40% of our survey respondents identified diversity, equity, and inclusion within nonprofits as one of the top 5 most important issues facing the nonprofit sector. And this was tied for the third most often identified issue. And this was up from 31% a year ago. Almost a quarter of respondents said that this was an important issue for their organization to attend to as well. We also asked respondents, overall, how are your circumstances compared to a year ago? And you can see in the chart, we tracked this over time. We tracked it since 2008, actually. And unfortunately, you can see what happened in 2020, where more organizations were likely to admit, to say that their circumstances were worse than a year ago, versus only 29% that said that their circumstances on the whole were better. Again, not terribly surprising, but this chart does bring things kind of into stark picture. We also ask organizations to predict for the coming year, are your circumstances going to be better, worse, or about the same? A lot of organizations have a lot of uncertainty. They don't necessarily want to hazard a guess, but among those that did, there's a high degree of feeling that if nothing else, considering how bad 2020 was, things can only go up. But 62% feel that next year things will be better, and only 5% thought that things were going to get even worse than they had been. But obviously a lot can happen there, and except for years like the financial collapse of 2009, or an incident like COVID, nonprofits are pretty good at predicting these things. The actual stats kind of track pretty closely to the predictions. So we will certainly hope and watch and do what we can to make sure that that optimistic prediction comes to pass. So what are nonprofits doing? Nonprofits are doing a lot of things you might expect. First and foremost, they are seeking new and alternative revenues, new funding sources, or increased funding from their existing philanthropic partners or donors. They're trying to engage in recruiting more volunteers. That has been especially challenging during the pandemic, of course, since in-person contact has been either restricted or just challenging. A lot of nonprofits, of course, have converted major events to a virtual platform. Advocacy has increased, more collaboration. Nonprofits always in our survey report that they are collaborating more. There are a lot of really interesting examples, some of which are described in the report, and even more of that's happening now. And of course, adjusting programs and budgets to the extent possible, sharing services. In a small subset of organizations, mergers are part of the discussion, but look to that to increase. There's going to be more pressure on nonprofits to merge, either because of resource scarcity or, quite frankly, pressure from the philanthropic community, from some funding partners, to explore that with greater intent. We know that a lot of organizations were never able to work remotely, but among those that did, 10% said that they have fully resumed their in-person operations. A quarter say that they've kind of got a hybrid thing going on, with some employees working in person and some working remotely. About a quarter are waiting until a vaccine is widely deployed so that employees and clientele can get back together safely. And 10% have said this remote thing is working pretty well. We're going to keep it going permanently. The savings on physical plant and other things can be a really powerful motivator there. The bottom line here is that New Jersey needs a strong nonprofit community. If nothing else, the pandemic has underscored just how vital nonprofits are. There's an elevated attention and appreciation for the services that nonprofits provide, the role nonprofits play, the inspiration that nonprofits provide, or mental health healing, and all sorts of other important services and protections and programs. The problem, of course, goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation, and that is there is a cost associated with years of chronic underfunding of nonprofits and their key infrastructure supports that are needed to make them strong and to keep them strong. I have used this picture before, but if you think about a good, strong, functioning nonprofit as essentially a Jenga tower with the systems and structures are in place and it's strong all the way around, if you start to starve the organization, and Google the nonprofit starvation cycle, it's an article from 2009, it's a really important read, but if you start to chip away at that infrastructure, by some angles, the things might look okay, but you're really weakening the overall until eventually the whole thing is going to collapse. And we're seeing more of that. We're seeing more of organizations at risk of collapse because the reserves weren't there, the investment in the infrastructure wasn't there because they're not being funded adequately to do the work. And that's a long-standing problem, and we need to get rid of it. We need to address it once and for all. So what are some of the things that we can do? These, again, are things that I'm sure have occurred to you. By all means, put some other suggestions in the chat, or you can be more specific about them. What nonprofits have told us they need a few things. First and foremost, they need funding and resources. They need funding from the government. They need more relief. I'm going to have a call to action that I'm going to ask you to engage in just a moment. But nonprofits, and they need more funding from their foundation partners, from their donors. It's a very difficult time to keep saying, oh, please give more, but on the foundation side of things, foundations really stepped up during the past year, finding ways to get more money in the hands of organizations that needed it, either to kind of keep them going or to, in recognition of the increased demand for services and the urgent need out there in the community. The question is that going to continue in the coming years? And certainly the urge from the nonprofit community is, please make that happen. Flexibility goes hand in hand with that. Again, a lot of funding partners told nonprofits you could free your restricted funds for general operating, or be a little bit more flexible with respect to their use, or lightening up on some of the reporting requirements. There were a lot of things that funding partners did, and the hope again is that a lot of those things might continue and take the form of more general operating support, perhaps multi-year grants and whatnot. Stability also goes hand in hand with this. Organizations need to know where they stand with funding partners, as well as what's coming down the pike. And uncertainty is reigning supreme right now, but that's certainly something that organizations are crying out for. Communications is a must across the board, not just with funding partners, but with constituents, with the public, with your stakeholders, with your board. And a lot of organizations have been doing this since day one, but it's more important than ever. And that's certainly, and nonprofits, it's a two-way street. Nonprofits want to be kept informed. Partnerships are more important than ever. And again, a lot of really important and creative things going on. And professional assistants that can take the form of attorneys, accountants, insurance professionals.
You have to go to Al's now, or are they just going to call you later?
No, they're going to call me.
So we don't have to go to Al's.
No, the good thing we did not.
Somebody needs to be muted. Thank you. So again, plenty that could be added to this list, but these are some of the fundamental needs and requests that organizations have been asking for. And I'm going to pivot back to what I was talking about a minute ago, which was the need for more relief from the government. Down in DC, Congress is debating right now the terms and scope of the next COVID relief package. As we know, there have been a couple of them passed, most recently in December, but there's dire need for more. And there is a sign-on letter that has been circulated by the National Council of Nonprofits and other national advocates that has collected 3,000 or 4,000 signatures, 100 plus from New Jersey. But what My ask is a simple one. One of my colleagues will type the link into the chat box, and I'm asking you today, before you leave this call, if you have not already signed on to this letter, if you haven't signed your organization onto this letter, please do it now. It literally takes 2 minutes, and it's a really important way just to send a signal to our elected officials in Washington that this stuff is important. What's included in this request are things like increased aid to state and local governments, and more robust charitable giving incentive, better relief for nonprofit employers who are some of whom are facing steep unemployment bills because they had to lay people off during the pandemic. And there are other things in the letter, so I certainly encourage you to look at that. But please take a moment before you leave this call to sign on, because that's going to be sent to leadership relatively shortly. It's been open for a little while, so this is a really good chance. I've been talking for quite some time, so I'm going to look or invite my colleagues from the center to tell me if there's anything in the chat box, or if you have questions, please put them in the chat box, or anything that's surprising or anything that you'd like to delve more deeply into. Again, the report is up on the website, so you can access that, and we will also send this as a follow-up to you, the link to it. But let me stop talking and see if there are things in the chat box.
Linda, there is a question about, does anyone know what the governor's budget looks like in the way of funding to cover unfunded costs being navigated by nonprofits? Pandemic safety practices of all kinds have a cost that will continue over the course of vaccine rollout and likely for a time beyond. Also, nonprofits will be vital to recovery. There will be new and rising needs to address mental health, addiction, homelessness, food insecurity, and all of that.
Yes, and that is an excellent question, and we're still looking at that, and I would certainly defer to colleagues on the call who are analyzing specific department budgets. I mean, I've seen some signals that there's some positive signs in the budget with respect to cost of living adjustments for nonprofit providers, which have not gotten increases in quite some time, and more aid to or resources for the Economic Development Authority and other channels where nonprofits can get funding. There was, I honestly don't know the status of it, and somebody on the call probably does, the status of the discounted PPE program that was being run through the Economic Development Authority. Again, I'm welcome other information from others. We're still looking at what the budget means kind of across the board, but welcome any updates or intel that other people have. I see the question that says 90% of charities have revenues of 1 million or less. Yes, the answer is yes. That is true. The vast majority, overwhelming majority of public charities are 1 million or less on the small side, and even something like 80% are 500,000 or less. This is a very community-based sector.
Yeah, there's some other comments in the chat box. Health and Human Services is providing free cloth masks. Check the OFBI, the Office of Faith-Based Initiative website for more information. There's some information like that. So certainly if sharing those tips with us is also a big help for everybody.
And we can forward the chat as well as part of the follow-up. So you'll get all of this information if you aren't writing it down or seeing it right now. But I do see a lot of great leads. Somebody was mentioning Catch a Fire, which is being funded by Robert Wood Johnson, a great avenue for skills-based volunteers. Thank you, Sally George, for mentioning that. And there's a link in the chat, so take a look at that. AFP, the Association of Fundraising Professionals, is co-hosting with the African American Development Officers a free webinar about recruiting to empower diversity. So certainly check that out. And other links are being provided in the chat. Other questions, thoughts? Anything you want to revisit? Anything that surprised you? Okay, I will keep, somebody's asking, Nancy Sargent is asking an email address to send information about resources that we may come across. You can email them, and I will segue to the next segment here. You can email them to our main account, which is center@njnonprofits.org. And we are a small but mighty team. The totality of our staff team are on this call. So things get forwarded right away. Kathy Hawn is our first stop there, but she forwards things to us all the time or addresses things all the time. So let me keep going here. I would be remiss if I did not mention again, invite you all to consider becoming a Center for Nonprofits member if you are not already a member. It's a great investment in your organization, and you have access as a member to all sorts of learning and networking opportunities, priority access to our staff experts on our help desk, discounts galore on our annual conference, and other offerings. So please take a moment to check that out. We'd be happy to answer any questions about that. We also have a Know Your Center pre-recorded webinar on our website. So if you want to dive into that and get more information on your own time on demand, we have that as well. And we hope that you'll also stay in touch through various communications channels. If you're not on our email list, please sign up. We promise we do not spam you, and we do not share your address with anybody else. But we're also on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram, so follow us there. And quite honestly, sometimes information that we have to push out will reach you through our social media channels before we can either get it up on the website or get it in e-blast. So definitely make a point of following us on those channels if you can. As a reminder, the new report, New Jersey Nonprofits Trends and Outlook for 2021, is now on our website. The address is below on the bottom of your screen, but I'm sure somebody will put it in the chat box so that you can link to it, and we will send it within the next couple of days. You'll have the link, but if you can't wait, then you can go on our website and download it immediately. I would again like to thank Sobelco and Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield of New Jersey for supporting the survey again this year, and my profound thanks to everyone who completed the survey. We know that people are surveyed out, and we are sometimes prime offenders. We think surveys are important, but we know that it's not necessarily a light lift, and so your input informs our programming. It helps to strengthen our advocacy, and it helps us to give you information that you can use in your own planning. So again, we cannot thank you enough for taking the time to do this. And we hope you will stay in touch. And again, above all, I thank you all for everything that you are doing to keep our communities whole, to make our state and society better. What you do is absolutely invaluable, and we want to make sure that it is recognized and supported, and that you have the tools and resources that you need to fulfill your missions. And it doesn't work if we don't do it together. So we are all, we are here for you, and we hope you will call on us. If there are no more questions in the chat box or any other feedback that we should have right now, I will just, one little other reminder to please take a moment and put the, and sign the national letter. And if someone can put that back in the chat, it's a last chance, and we'll send that along in the follow-up if the letter is still open when we do. But hearing nothing else for feedback or for direct response, my thanks to Jonathan Pearson, to Sally Glick, to my wonderful colleagues at the Center for Nonprofits, Debbie, Caitlin, Doug, Susan, Kathy. We have an amazing team, and I'm so glad to be part of it. And thank you all for everything that you do, and we look forward to staying in touch. Thank you.